The day before they terminated my employment, I was standing in the break room of Aegis Systems, repairing the coffee machine. It was not in my job description, of course. I was the Director of Operations, a title I had held for 2 decades. But the new Human Resources Coordinator, a young woman who once accidentally sent her grocery list to the entire company email group, could not figure out how to clear a clogged pod chamber. So there I was, wearing a $12 blazer I had purchased at a discount store, scraping dried espresso grounds out of a plastic tube with a paperclip. I was 65 years old, with 20 years of operational knowledge, yet I was acting as a caffeinated plumber. As I worked, Julian Preston, our slick new chief executive officer, strode past the break room. His wireless earpiece was flashing blue, and he was speaking in the loud, performative tone of a man who believed every phone call was a matter of national security. He glanced in, saw me with my hands covered in coffee grime, and muttered, "Can we get facilities to handle that?" He did not look at me. If he had, he might have noticed the look in my eyes. But I did not say a word. I simply finished cleaning the machine, wiped my hands, and went back to my desk. That was what I did. I solved problems quietly, precisely, and without drama. I had started at Aegis Systems in the summer of 2002, when the company was just 4 desks in a cramped office next to a laser tag arena. In those days, I did everything. I ran the office, ordered printer paper, managed the basic ledger, negotiated vendor contracts, and onboarded every new hire. When the founders offered me stock options instead of a cash bonus that first Christmas, I did not throw them away. I read the paperwork carefully, signed it, and locked the physical certificates in a fireproof metal box under my bed, right next to my old tax returns and my divorce papers. Over the years, the other early employees had sold their shares. They cashed out during the Series B funding round, or when we moved into our first high-rise office downtown. But I held on to mine. I was not a financial wizard. I had simply forgotten they were there. By the time I remembered, the company had grown, and my shares were diluted, but they remained in the box. Recently, the culture at Aegis Systems had turned sour. Julian Preston was our 3rd chief executive officer in 5 years. He possessed the toxic combination of business school arrogance and a complete lack of operational experience. He called me Donald for the first month, then started calling me Daniel, and eventually stopped speaking to me altogether. He stopped inviting me to the weekly leadership meetings, and he quietly transferred my remaining staff to central operations. He even took credit for an inventory workflow I had designed in 2013 that had reduced overhead costs by 40%. I was not surprised when I opened the internal company newsletter on a Tuesday morning and saw the headline about a strategic transition. It was corporate jargon for an acquisition. A large private equity firm was buying Aegis Systems for $150 million. The merger was finalized, pending final board and shareholder approval. It meant a massive payout for Julian and his inner circle, plenty of public relations noise, and a rebranding effort. For me, it meant a small footnote in the transition plan. The newsletter stated that operational roles would be integrated under the incoming management team. I was being pushed out, and they had not even had the decency to tell me to my face. But I did not get angry. I simply printed the newsletter, folded it neatly, and placed it in my fireproof box at home, right behind my stock certificates. I had a feeling that something was coming, though I did not yet realize how deep a hole Julian was digging for himself. The notification came on a Friday afternoon at exactly 4:58. It was a calendar invitation with no description, simply titled Meeting. The sender was Clara Hensley, the Human Resources Director, who regularly used words like alignment and synergy during staff meetings. It was the classic late Friday ambush. I gathered my things, put on my blazer, and walked down the quiet hallway to conference room B. Julian Preston was already there, leaning back in his leather chair with his hands behind his head. Clara Hensley sat next to him, holding a thick manila folder as if it contained top-secret government documents. The room was cold, smelling of stale air and carpet cleaner. "Donald," Julian said, his voice dripping with the false warmth of a salesman, "come on in, sit down." I sat across from them and waited. I had seen this play before. I had helped write the templates for it 15 years ago, back when we actually cared about doing things properly. But Julian did not care about propriety. He only cared about speed and clearing the board. We really appreciate everything you have done for Aegis Systems, Julian continued, gesturing vaguely with his hand. 20 years is a remarkable run, truly. But as we prepare for this next chapter with the merger, we are restructuring our operations. We need to be agile. We need to streamline. It is not personal, Donald. It is just the natural evolution of the business. Clara Hensley nodded in agreement, sliding the manila folder across the polished table. We have put together a very generous transition package for you, she said, offering a tight, practiced smile. I opened the folder. Inside was the standard paperwork: a termination letter, a severance agreement, offering 3 months of salary, a non-disclosure agreement, and a document labeled Waiver of Shareholder Claims. I turned to the second page of the waiver. My eyes stopped on a specific paragraph. It was not standard boilerplate. It was a comprehensive release of all voting rights, proxy designations, and class protections. This paragraph, I said, pointing to the text without looking up at them. This is not standard severance language. Julian shrugged, his expression remaining perfectly relaxed. Our legal team insists on it for all early equity holders, he said. It is just a symbolic cleanup. Those old shares are practically worthless now, anyway, after the dilution rounds. We are doing you a favor by cashing them out as part of this package. I looked at Julian, then at Clara. I had spent 2 decades reviewing contracts. I knew when someone was trying to hide a trap in the fine print. I set the pen down on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge of the folder. I will need some time to review these documents, I said, keeping my voice level and calm. Julian leaned forward, flashing the same mock concern he used during company meetings. Of course, Donald, but we really need this wrapped up by Monday morning to keep the transition on schedule. We want to ensure a clean exit for everyone. I closed the manila folder and stood up. I will not be signing anything today, and from this point forward, I would prefer that any communication regarding my departure go through my attorney. A heavy silence fell over the room. Clara Hensley stopped smiling, her fingers frozen over her tablet. Julian stared at me, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he had just noticed a glitch in his favorite software. You are not disputing the severance amount, are you? He asked, his voice losing its warm veneer. I am not discussing it at all, I replied. I straightened my blazer, picked up my briefcase, and walked out of the conference room. I did not slam the door. I did not make a scene. I simply walked down the hallway, said goodbye to the receptionist, and took the elevator down to the garage. By the time I drove out into the late afternoon traffic, the initial numbness had faded. In its place was a sharp, clear focus. I had worked in corporate environments long enough to recognize desperation when I saw it. Julian and Clara had been too eager, too hurried. The inclusion of that specific shareholder waiver in a standard severance package was not a routine cleanup. It was a targeted maneuver. They were trying to strip me of something they knew I had, something that represented a potential obstacle to their $150 million merger. When I arrived at my house, I did not pour a drink or turn on the television. I went straight to the hall closet, pushed aside the winter coats, and pulled out the old metal box. The lock was rusty, and I had to force the key to turn, but eventually the lid popped open. Inside lay the physical history of my career: yellowing paper, handwritten notes, and original option agreements from the early days of Aegis Systems. I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by folders, and began to read. I stayed up all night drinking black coffee and running calculations on a legal pad. My mind worked through 2 decades of corporate restructuring, stock splits, and dilution formulas. By 6 o'clock the next morning, the floor was covered in documents, and I had my answer. The key was an amendment dated June 9th, 2006. At the time, our former chief financial officer, Lester Vance, had been deeply concerned about the threat of a hostile takeover. He had convinced the founders to insert a protective clause into the shareholder agreement. The clause was designed to protect early loyal investors. It stated that if any original Class A shareholder or group of legacy shareholders held a combined voting percentage that met or exceeded 2.75% of the active voting stock, they retained absolute veto power over any material corporate transaction. This included mergers, acquisitions, or liquidation. Over the years, almost every other early employee had sold their stock or signed away their legacy rights when they left the company. Some had traded their voting rights for cash during the Series A funding round. Others had simply let their options expire. But I had never sold. I had never signed a waiver. I had never transferred my shares. I took out my calculator and began to verify the math. When I accounted for the shares that had been bought back by the company, the expired options, and the current outstanding voting stock, my small block of original shares amounted to exactly 3.14% of the active Class A voting stock. I was above the 2.75% threshold. I leaned back against the sofa, my heart hammering in my chest. The math was clear, and it was irrefutable. I did not just own shares in Aegis Systems. I owned a blocking position. Under the terms of the 2006 agreement, Julian Preston could not sell this company to a private equity firm without my written consent. My unsigned waiver was the only thing standing between him and his $150 million merger. This was why they had tried to rush me. This was why Clara Hensley had looked so anxious when I slid the folder back across the table. They had hoped I would sign the severance agreement without reading the fine print, effectively cashing out my shares for a few $1,000s and giving up my veto power. If I signed, they were free. If I refused, the entire merger was frozen. I looked out the window as the sun began to rise over the neighbor's yard. I felt no anger now, only a quiet, cold determination. Julian Preston had spent the last 2 years treating me as if I were invisible, an obsolete relic of the past, who could be swept aside to make room for his new vision. He had taken my work, stripped me of my staff, and terminated my employment on a Friday afternoon to avoid an awkward conversation. But he had forgotten to check the foundation of the house he was trying to sell. He had assumed that because I was quiet, I was also foolish. He was about to find out that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding the keys. The pressure began on Monday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. An email landed in my personal inbox from Clara Hensley, titled Gentle Reminder. It was filled with corporate pleasantries, urging me to return the signed transition documents so they could finalize my exit experience. I did not reply. I deleted the message. At 11:47, a second email arrived, this time from Jeffrey, the senior internal legal counsel for Aegis Systems. His tone was far less polite. He wrote that my delay in signing the waiver was introducing unnecessary complications for pending corporate activities. He hinted that withholding my signature could be viewed as a breach of my duty to the company, and warned of potential legal action. I did not reply to Jeffrey either. On Tuesday, Julian Preston tried a direct approach. He called my personal mobile phone. I was in the middle of preparing lunch when the screen lit up with his name. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but then decided it would be useful to hear the tone of his voice. "Donald," Julian said, his voice loud and artificial. "I just wanted to touch base. I noticed we haven't received your signed paperwork yet. I thought maybe there was some confusion about the terms." "There is no confusion," I replied, keeping my voice flat. A brief silence followed on the line. I could hear him shifting in his chair. "Well, look, Donald. I understand that leaving a company after 20 years is difficult. But dragging this out does not benefit anyone, least of all you. You really do not want this to turn into a hostile situation. Let us keep this clean and professional." "I am simply reviewing the documents thoroughly," I said. Julian let out a dry laugh. "Come on, Donald. Those early shares do not mean anything now. If you want to avoid a massive legal headache, I suggest you sign the papers." "You do not want to burn your bridges here, do you?" I did not answer. I hung up the phone and blocked his number. By Wednesday afternoon, the leadership team had launched a quiet smear campaign. A former colleague sent me a screenshot of an internal messaging channel. A director in the sales department had posted a message questioning what I had actually contributed to the company over the last 5 years. Another thread suggested I had been let go due to poor performance and an inability to adapt to modern processes. It was a classic corporate tactic. Discredit the person you are trying to destroy. They wanted to create a narrative that I was bitter and incompetent so that if I did try to fight, no one would believe me. But they were fighting the wrong battle. They thought I was planning to file a wrongful termination lawsuit. They had no idea that I was holding the key to their entire merger. On Thursday morning, I drove to a small professional building on the edge of the city. I walked up the stairs to a modest office and sat across from Rebecca Geller. She was in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and a calm, methodical demeanor. She specialized in corporate governance and labor law, and her office smelled of old paper and leather. I handed her the folder containing my stock certificates, the 2006 amendment, and the severance package. Rebecca read through the document slowly, her pen tapping a quiet rhythm on her desk. When she finished, she looked up and smiled. "They have made a catastrophic mistake," she said. Rebecca explained the legal landscape. "First, my immediate termination, along with the layoff of 12 other employees in our department, was a direct violation of the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, also known as 29 U.S.C. Section 2101. The law required Aegis Systems to provide 60 days advance written notice for a mass layoff or plant closing. They had provided zero notice, meaning they were already liable for 60 days of back pay and benefits for every affected employee. Second, the 2006 amendment was ironclad. As long as I held 3.14% of the Class A voting stock, my veto rights were active and non-transferable. But here is the most interesting part, Rebecca said, pointing to the merger agreement that had been filed with the regulatory authorities. Julian Preston and the board have already certified to the acquiring firm that they have obtained unanimous consent from all legacy shareholders. They represented this as a completed fact in their filings. If they did that without your signature, they have committed a material misrepresentation, which is a breach of fiduciary duty to the shareholders. "What do we do?" I asked. "We do nothing," Rebecca said, leaning back in her chair. "We send a simple letter stating that you have not waived your rights and that all future communications must go through me. Then, we let them panic. When a deal of this size is frozen, the interest rates, the investor commitments, and the legal fees start piling up. They will come to us." That afternoon, Rebecca sent a 2-line email to Jeffrey at Aegis Systems. It stated that Donald Barrett had not waived any of his shareholder rights and that all inquiries should be directed to her office. The fuse was lit. Now we just had to wait for the explosion. The crack in Julian's plan appeared on Thursday afternoon at the offices of the acquiring private equity firm. A junior legal associate named Valerie Scott was tasked with conducting the final audit of the Aegis Systems shareholder ledger. It was a tedious, exhausting job, the kind of assignment usually given to the youngest lawyers who were too tired to argue. But Valerie possessed a sharp eye for detail and a clean work ethic. She was cross-referencing the cap table percentages with the physical consent forms when she noticed a discrepancy. The documentation for the merger claimed that 100% of the legacy class of shareholders had consented to the transaction. However, when she looked for the signature page for Donald Barrett, the file was empty. There was no waiver, no proxy agreement, and no consent form. She double-checked the records, searching through years of corporate archives but found nothing. Valerie brought the folder to her supervising partner, who immediately realized the significance of her discovery. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a high-priority conference call was arranged. Between the acquiring firm's lead counsel, Eleanor Sharp, and the leadership of Aegis Systems, including Julian Preston, Randall Vance, and their outside counsel, Julian, true to form, attempted to brush the issue aside. "Donald Barrett is a non-factor," Julian said, his voice echoing through the speakerphone. "He was our operations manager, and he was off-boarded last Friday. We have his exit package. The lack of a signature is just an administrative delay. He is a retired employee, and his shares are completely diluted." Eleanor Sharp was not impressed. "Julian, I am looking at the original incorporation documents and the subsequent amendments," she said, her voice cool and clinical. "Under the amendment dated June 9, 2006, any legacy shareholder with more than 2.75% of the class of voting stock holds veto power over this merger. Our audit shows that Donald Barrett owns 3.14%. He has not signed the waiver, and his attorney has formally notified us that he has not waived his rights. This is not an administrative delay. This is a block transaction." A heavy silence fell over the call. Randall Vance, the chief financial officer of Aegis Systems, looked as though he might throw up. He knew the math. If the merger stalled, the private equity firm had the right to walk away from the deal entirely, taking their $150 million with them. The entire financial house of cards they had built was on the verge of collapse. "Is there a workaround?" Julian asked, his voice rising in pitch. "Can we dilute his shares further, or vote to overwrite the 2006 amendment?" "Absolutely not," Eleanor Sharp replied. "Any attempt to alter his rights retroactively without his consent would be a clear breach of fiduciary duty and would expose both Aegis Systems and the board to massive liability. Furthermore, because Donald Barrett is 65 years old, any attempt to coerce or deceive him into signing away his rights could be prosecuted under California Welfare and Institutions Code Section 15610.30, which governs financial elder abuse. The wrongful taking or appropriation of an elder's property for a fraudulent purpose carries treble damages and attorney fees. We will not touch a transaction with that kind of legal liability. We also have concerns about the potential violations of 29 U.S.C. Section 2101, as you terminated multiple operations staff members without the required notice." Julian was speechless. The man who had spent the last 2 years treating me as if I did not exist was suddenly staring at the ruins of his career, all because he had ignored a 65-year-old operations manager. By Friday morning, the panic at Aegis Systems had reached a boiling point. Randall Vance called Rebecca Geller's office directly, bypassing Jeffrey and the outside legal team. He was no longer offering threats, he was offering money. Rebecca put the call on speakerphone so I could hear it. "Rebecca," Randall Vance said, his voice shaking slightly, "we want to resolve this amicably. We are prepared to offer Donald a special consulting transition bonus. If he signs the waiver today, we will pay him $250,000 immediately upon the closing of the merger. It is a very generous offer, and it allows everyone to move forward without further delay." I leaned forward and spoke into the phone. "Randall," I said, "you can tell Julian that I support the growth of the company. I do not support the amateurs who came in late and think they can rewrite the contracts to suit their own pockets. The offer is rejected." I hung up the phone. Rebecca smiled at me. "They are completely desperate," she said. "The private equity firm has given them 48 hours to resolve the shareholder issue, or they will freeze the deal. They have no options left." "What is our next step?" I asked. "We wait for the board meeting on Monday," Rebecca said. "They have called an emergency session to resolve the impasse. We will attend, and we will set the terms." I went home and spent the weekend working in my garden. For the first time in years, I did not feel the weight of corporate stress. I knew that the system Julian had used to push me out was the very system that would now bring him to his knees. The emergency board meeting was called for Monday morning at 9 o'clock in the main conference room of Aegis Systems. The room was spacious, featuring a large mahogany table and panoramic windows overlooking the city skyline. But the atmosphere inside was tense, filled with the quiet rustle of papers and the low murmurs of nervous executives. Julian Preston sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man who had not slept all weekend. Randall Vance sat to his right, staring blankly at a legal pad. On the other side of the table sat Eleanor Sharp and the representatives of the acquiring private equity firm. At exactly 9 o'clock, Rebecca Geller and I walked into the room. We did not apologize for our arrival. We did not offer handshakes. We simply sat at the empty chairs at the far end of the table. Rebecca placed a single black folder in the center of the mahogany surface and slid it toward Eleanor Sharp. "Inside this folder," Rebecca said, her voice clear and resonant in the quiet room, "you will find the original equity agreements, the option certificates, and the signed amendment from June 9, 2006. As we have previously notified your counsel, my client, Donald Barrett, holds 3.14% of the Class A voting stock. Under the terms of the 2006 amendment, he is exercising his right to veto the proposed merger between Aegis Systems and your firm." Eleanor Sharp opened the folder, reviewed the pages slowly, and then nodded to her associates. She closed the folder and looked across the table at Julian. "The documentation is valid," Eleanor said. "The veto is active. As of this moment, the merger is frozen. We cannot proceed with the transaction under these conditions. Julian slammed his palms on the table and stood up. This is absurd, he shouted, his face turning red. Donald, you are sabotaging this company. You are holding a $150 million deal hostage out of spite because we terminated your employment. You are letting your personal feelings get in the way of a massive business success. I looked at Julian, refusing to let my expression waver. This is not about personal feelings, Julian, I said. This is about contracts. The same contracts you ignored when you took credit for my workflows, stripped me of my staff, and fired me on a Friday afternoon to avoid an awkward conversation. You believed I was a line item that could be erased. I am simply reminding you that I am a shareholder. Rebecca Geller stood up and opened a second folder. If you wish to resolve this impasse and obtain my client's consent, we have a list of non-negotiable terms, she said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table to the board chairperson. First, Rebecca continued, the merger agreement must be revised to include a dedicated compensation pool for all legacy Class A shareholders, ensuring they receive their fair share of the acquisition value without the dilution of recent funding rounds. Second, Julian Preston's exit package and golden parachute are to be canceled immediately. He will receive 0 bonuses and 0 consulting fees from the merger. Third, Aegis Systems will issue a formal statement to all shareholders and industry partners, clarifying that Donald Barrett's departure was not performance-based or disciplinary, and publicly recognizing his 20 years of operational service. Finally, the company will pay full compensation and back pay to all 13 operations employees who were terminated last week in violation of 29 U.S.C. Section 2101. Julian stared at the paper in disbelief. This is extortion, he screamed. You are blacklisting me. You cannot let them do this. He looked at the board members, searching for support, but they all avoided his gaze. Randall Vance was looking at his hands, and the chairperson was reviewing the terms with a grim expression. If we do not agree to these terms, the board chairperson asked Rebecca, what happens? The veto stands, Rebecca replied. The merger fails, and we will proceed with a formal lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, violations of 29 U.S.C. Section 2101, and financial elder abuse under California Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15610.30. Eleanor Sharp leaned forward. From the perspective of the acquiring firm, these terms are acceptable. We have no interest in inheriting a company with active shareholder litigation and regulatory violations. If you want this deal to close, you will agree to these revisions. If not, we are walking away. The board chairperson looked at Julian, then at the other board members. He sighed, a tired, defeated sound. We will accept the terms, he said. Julian fell back into his chair, his jaw slack. He looked defeated, his slick confidence entirely evaporated. He was no longer the powerful chief executive officer directing airstrikes. He was just a young man who had played a game he did not understand and lost. Rebecca handed me the updated waiver, which now included our terms and the revised compensation schedules. I took out my pen, signed my name on the line, and slid the paper back to the chairperson. I stood up, adjusted my blazer, and picked up my briefcase. Rebecca did the same, a quiet smile on her face. Before I walked out the door, I turned to look at Julian one last time. Good luck cashing your bonus, Julian, I said softly. He did not reply. He simply stared at the table, his face pale. As we walked out into the bright morning sunshine, I felt a deep sense of peace. I had spent 20 years working in the background, keeping the machines running and the office quiet. I had never asked for praise, and I had never sought the spotlight. But when they tried to treat me as if I did not exist, I had shown them that the foundation of a company is not its executives or its buzzwords. It is the people who do the work. I was no longer an employee of Aegis Systems. I was a free man with my dignity intact, my record cleared, and a substantial financial future secured. I walked to my car, ready to start the next chapter of my life on my own terms.